Hi, I'm Vijay Prashad, Chief Editor at Leftward Books. On the 21st of February this year, we released a conversation that I had had with Professor Aijaz Ahmad about the Communist Manifesto as part of Leftward Books' offering for Red Books Day. The manifesto was published on the 21st of February, 1848, which is why we hold Red Books Day on that day. At the close of that conversation, it became clear that it would be quite useful, very useful, in fact, to continue these conversations about some of Marx's most important political writings. And we decided subsequently that the next conversation after the Communist Manifesto should be on the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, Marx's work which he published in 1852. So we're back now. Aijaz, welcome back to Leftward Books.
Thank you very much.
Well, before I throw it to you, I wanted to just say a few things briefly. The text is called the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. The word Brumaire always throws people off. It's essentially a calendar word. It refers to the 2nd of December. This is the date on the 2nd of December 1851 when Louis Napoleon III, conducted, I suppose we can call it for now, a coup d'etat, and took power, seized power. He chose the date carefully, cleverly. It's the same date as in 1804, Napoleon I crowned himself emperor. The next year, on that same day, 2nd of December 1805, Napoleon led his army to victory in the Battle of Austerlitz. A very clever choice of the Brumaire to conduct his coup d'etat. Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III, was many things, but he was pretty sharp to have done this. Well, we're going to start with this text, a text that's both well known. Many people know so many of the lines, at least in the opening of the text. They've come to an aphoristic level. People know some of the lines from the text. It's very well known, but it's also very little known because it's a very deep text and there's a lot in it that I think people need to get into. So to start us off, Aijaz, could you just sort of orient us to this text, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon?
Vijay, you're quite right. It is very well known and at the same time, very little known. It's very well known precisely because of those great aphoristic formulations in the beginning of the text, but also the last section, section 7, I think, of the text, where he talks about the nature of the state and also some pages on the peasantry. A part of that is that in The State and Revolution, Lenin's great book, which is relatively better known compared to the 18th Brumaire, Lenin takes a lot of the extracts and he actually constructs the Marxist theory of the state from the early texts like the Manifesto and through the 18th Brumaire, the Civil War in France, 18th Brumaire, up to the later texts like the Civil War in France and so on. For Lenin, this and the Marxist writings in the Paris Commune are actually at the heart of the theory of the state. So within the Marxist people who are interested in Marxist theory, it very often the text is known through Lenin's reconstruction of it rather than the text itself. More generally, beyond the Marxist circles, and within Marxist circles, but beyond the Marxist circles, 18th Brumaire is greatly admired as Marx was one of the great stylists of all time, certainly of the 19th century. And 18th Brumaire is very much like the Manifesto, and later on some of the writings on the Paris Commune, stylistically a great masterpiece, and this aphoristic opening that you're referring to is part of that great stylistic ability um, to capture thought in language that lasts for 100, 150, 200 years. So there's that. But it is not so well known truly because bulk of the text refers to, in fact, takes you very, very carefully through the actual day-to-day politics of those 3 years in France. And and a lot of it is so dense with that kind of factual reference that a contemporary reader often gets lost in them and stops reading it. So the actual text is known very little in that sense. Parts of it are very well known. That's one. The other, in my view, there is a very interesting relation between the Communist Manifesto and the 18th Brumaire. 18th Brumaire is more or less a sort of counterpoint to the Great Manifesto. Manifesto comes in expectation of the revolution. And indeed, the revolution of 1848 breaks out within weeks of in fact, the publication of the manifesto, in fact, more or less coincides with the outbreak of the Paris Revolution, which then extends to large parts of Europe, particularly Germany, but also very large parts of Europe. This text comes as a way of looking back from the beginning of the revolution to the completion of the counter-revolution. It is also, there are, of course, intermediate texts, a number of Marx's own writings on this period, which were collected later by Engels under the title Class Struggles in France. And part of the density of the 18th Brumaire is owed to the fact that the readers that he is addressing not only know quite a bit about the events in France, but that audience has already read his articles. So in a certain sense, reading 18th Brumaire presumes that you have read the articles in Class Struggles in France. And he can then just condense everything and revisit and refine the arguments which were already there in Class Struggles in France. That's the general sort of setting of the text. What Engels actually says much later, and what is certainly true, is that the manifesto gives you the premises of Marxist theory, as does the poverty of philosophy and some chapters in German ideology. All of that gets condensed in the manifesto. What 18th Brumaire poses, the question that 18th Brumaire poses and resolves, is can this very general theory of class struggle, the bourgeois state, capitalist mode of production, and so on, can this very general theory be applied? And can you understand the ongoing political processes of any given time in light of how does class manifest itself in politics as the political relations are actually lived from one day to the next, 1 year to the next. And that is what he sets out to show, that underneath the surfaces, what are the actual class forces that are active in the what are the structural class determinations of day-to-day politics, and how you can really analyze those and reach at the class character of what is actually going on. Which also then you can turn around and say that there actually is no access to the reality of class struggle except through the understanding of how it manifests itself in day-to-day politics. So that. The other thing that is very striking to me is that whereas the Communist Manifesto talks about the very essence of class relations in capitalist society, and therefore the emphasis is on total polarization between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. In fact, the simplification of class antagonism into two great contending classes. That is how the question of the capitalist structure is posed in the manifesto. That is a theoretical approach which talks about the essence of a structure. This is very much, I mean, in a very, very much more mature way. That is what Marx does in Capital. That capital is not a description of capitalism as it works from day to day, but the very fundamental structure, the logic of the move. And that's what it gives you there. What happens in his analyses of actual politics is what comes through is the multiplicity of political forces and multiplicity of class factions. It's not that you have multiplicity of classes, but classes also break into factions, fractions, which may be, for example, in his commentary on the peasantry, he distinguishes between different sections of the peasantry, the relationship of the peasantry to the army, and so on. And then he goes into the minutiae of ideological issues that actually sort of trump the manifest class relations. For example, the very fact that the thing that Napoleon, it's very interesting that the French Revolution finally had to really fully, was both negated and extended by Napoleon. And it was under Napoleon that the small-holding peasant classes, the true breakup of feudal property and the stabilization of the small-holding peasantry actually came to occupy the great majority of the French population became owners of small-scale property. And therefore, they associated their gain of property with the name Napoleon. And how Louis Napoleon plays on that, and how the peasantry thinks of the name Napoleon as the legitimate heir of the great revolutionary tradition, which had broken up feudal relations and so on. So how the ideological effect of a particular historical development outlasts its own moment in which that ideology is formed. Uh, so in that way, what he shows is that in his time at least, how different political parties were represented different class interests and overlapping interests. How the institutions of the state, such as the National Guard, the army, how are these institutions connected not only to the structure of the state as understood in Marxist theory, but also in terms of its class groups. What are the classes from which the army, for example, is recruited, the peculiar relationship between the peasantry and the army, and a very very complex ways in which the peasantry, for example, the French peasantry. There's one very interesting moment in the text where he says that the misery of peasant life is such that when one of them goes into the army, the misery turns into heroism, and and the uniform becomes the symbol of this transition from misery to heroism, and you start identifying with that, etc. So in other words, I mean, that is what is at the heart, for me, at the heart of the text. Can this great theory be used to analyze the multiplicity of struggles that are involved when different fractions of classes organize themselves politically? Ultimately, of course, this great form of what we came to know as Bonapartism. Again, there's something very interesting to me. In the manifesto, I think it is in the manifesto, this idea that there are moments in which the class struggle doesn't necessarily end in the triumph of one class over the other, but to the common ruination of the contending classes. Now, in a very strange way, the rise of Bonaparte is relatively that kind of moment in which the various monarchist factions, the various factions of the bourgeoisie, the industrial, the financial aristocracy, as Marx calls them, when they cancel each other out, while also canceling out proletarian power.
I want to come back to the counter-revolution in a few moments, but let's stay with this question of class, because it strikes me that this is probably one of Marx's longest statements of an assessment of, well, let me put it this way. You can't really call this a text that is the anatomy of class. It's more an anatomy of class struggle, because in this text, class is not a static thing. It's not just the objective class position which you inherit and which you live in, but it's also how you understand yourself in the world. At one point when he's talking about the farmers, he says they are not a class, they are a mass. And they are a mass precisely because they don't have the subjective sense of themselves as a class with a political program and so on. So they are delivered to others. The point you made, when I was reading that section where he talks about the relationship of the peasantry to the military or the police, I got immediately two contemporary examples. One is the uprising in Egypt, which was essentially an urban uprising. And the military forces that came to fire at the Tahrir Square protesters were all basically peasants from the countryside who had no Tahrir Square in their villages, in Upper Egypt and so on. The other example is the farmers' revolt in India, where when the government abused the farmers and said you're anti-national, well, their children who were in the serving in the armed forces said, no, these are our parents, and came and stood in uniform and gave their medals back and so on. There is an interesting way in which the politics of the peasantry is also refracted into the state, not only through their relations with land revenue and so on, but also the recruits of the forces of repression. The text is bristling. I mean, as I said, an anatomy of a static class system. These are the classes and so on. This text bristles with the class struggle. So at one level, he is what later in the contribution to the critique of political economy, in the preface, he says, well, there are these objective structures, and then, we fight it out in politics, he says. The class is fought out in politics. This seems to be the theater of the class struggle. Can you talk a little bit about how different this text is, say, from Marx's contemporaries who are trying to understand sociologically, the phenomena of what would be class?
You see, for me, what is very important is Marx's recognition that class struggle can be understood only if you keep in mind the various mediations that intervene in the daily structures of political struggle. That what happens in the political field is that such diverse forces, some representing the new rising classes, some representing the old dying classes, they all try to organize themselves in some political form or the other to have their piece of the in this arena, there are major political forces, what Marx goes on calling the party of order, in which the two past monarchical dynastic forces are represented politically in them. And what you realize is that what he's also capturing is those 3 years of a very long-term struggle in French history between republicanism and monarchism. So when he's talking about the struggle between the true republicans and the party of order, and how Louis Bonaparte actually plays them against each other. So what I also want to say is that class does not appear when you're dealing with actual political struggles of that sort. Class appears to you embodied in political forces. It doesn't appear in front of you in its own purity and wholeness. And it is those representational bodies of the political sphere with their diverse ideological baggage that you have to analyze and go through in order to get at the class content of. So class content does not reveal itself to you on the surface. What comes to my mind is absurdly Hegel's famous thing that what is real cannot be true. What you see on the surface is not the true essence of class struggle. Class struggle doesn't, present itself in that mode. Class struggle itself is at the basis of these other kind of contentions which you can see, and it is through analysis and through theoretical operation that the factity of facts can be understood.
Can you just say a little more about that? Because I think that's important. You started off by saying that the center of the text is chock filled with detail, because Marx is going, and not just detail, but very densely described events as a consequence of the fact that his readers knew what he's talking about. He's written about it in a kind of accordion way earlier in the essays that are published in Class Struggles in France. Tell us a little bit about the role of detail and the importance of mediation in building a theory, because I think there's a glib feeling that a theory basically means that you have a kind of you have the big structures in play, but I think you're just saying right now that people don't always live the big structures. They live in different levels of reality. So could you tell us a little bit about why the detail is important and the role of mediation in building a theory?
You see, okay. Engels wrote a very interesting introduction, a third preface or something, in 1895 to Class Struggles in France, which is where the very facts that are covered in the 18th Brumaire are stated at greater length. And in that introduction, he says, quite in the beginning, he says, when you're analyzing the contemporary facts of your contemporary life, you're bound to make errors. And you're bound to make errors because all the facts, he also talks about the statistics. He says all the facts that you need to analyze the contemporary reality are not available to you at the same time. So you're bound to make errors. I would add to that the only way you can hedge yourself against those errors is by attention to detail. It's very easy to, apply a formula. What Marx teaches you is that theory is not something that can be applied to the facts. The facts exist in their own space beyond theory. That is the realm of the real. And as I said earlier, it is composed of great multiplicities and great conflicts. And so you can't really say peasantry is like this. He'll tell you what the different fractions are in the peasantry and which of them represents what. What is the revolutionary part of the peasantry? What is the reactionary part of the peasantry, and so on. Likewise, the bourgeoisie has many segments in it. So all classes are in fact exist in the reality of factions, in the reality of fractions, of groupings, that different parts of the same class struggle against each other. That in actual reality, there is no moment in which the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat comes out in a naked form between this confrontation. The political organization or the political field is much more complex, and it's out of that complexity by understanding it in detail that you get to know you get access to what is the what is the structural class determination of all of this. So in a certain sense, if I may put it in a way that might be confusing, that the actual class structure is the unconscious of politics. To put it in Freudian terms. It is by analyzing daily politics that you get to that structure, which is fundamentally hidden from you because of all of that superstructure of politics. So how to get from the superstructure to the structure through analysis of facts is what the text actually teaches.
This is very useful because this is precisely why this text should be read. I mean, okay, we have an interest in the 19th century, we have an interest in France, we have an interest in the times of Marx and so on. But there is something in that, you can read it for that. I mean, it really is, historians say it's relatively unsurpassed, regardless of what Engels writes in the 1895 Introduction to Class Struggles in France. The 18th Brumaire is really unsurpassed as a text to understand the coup of the Brumaire. I mean, it's untold by French historians. It's really superb.
Yeah, it's a gold standard.
Yeah, it's superb. So given that, we can read it for that. We can read it as a text of history to understand that moment. But also, I think what you're saying is important. It needs to be read so that we learn how to do an assessment of the politics of our own time. There's something in here which is about method, I feel, that
it's absolutely
what you're talking
method.
about.
It's absolutely about method.
Yeah, and that's the way we should read it. There's another way in which I think it's worth reading, not only this text, but a set of texts written by Marx and Engels in this time. The great event that took place just before Marx's death, of course, was before Marx's birth. He was born in 1813. The great event was the French Revolution, 1789, 1794, a revolution that, well, you know, Engels will write later that history moves in zigs and zags. You get a defeat for the working class or the revolutionary people after 1794. Then there's the 1830 uprising. Well, that is also cut down. Then there's 1848. That will be cut down. Later, we'll talk about 1871, the Paris Commune, and so on. It's not cycles. Engels is quite clear. It's not cycles. It's zigs and zags. It's maybe spirals, whether upward spirals or downward. But in this period of the 1850s, Marx is writing about France, Engels is writing about Germany. Although I must say, Engels, in his great modesty and affection for Marx, initially the essays on Germany were signed in Marx's names. Later it was discovered they were all written by Engels and published as Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, written also in 1851-52. It seems that both of these dear friends, looking at France and Germany, were occupied by this idea of the counter-revolution, of something happening that, you know, the party of order, the coup of 1852, the reverses in Germany, although there were not such great advances in Germany to begin with, but they're occupied by this moment of defeat for the working class struggle. It's not a permanent defeat, but nonetheless a setback. Of course, we seem to live in a long-term setback. What do we learn from their lessons on the counter-revolution, whether Bonapartism or the return of authoritarianism in Germany? What do we learn from them for their conjuncture, at least conceptually for our time?
Well, Marx actually says very clearly that what he learned above all is that the situation was not, you know, all right, from the point of view of the workers' movement, the proletarian uprising of June 48 is is the moment. And from then on, it was really in reaction to that uprising. In other words, the February Revolution actually was anti-monarchical, which brought the bourgeois republic into being, or restoration, or whatever you wish to call it. But it is the June uprising of the proletariat that united, in a certain sense, all the reactionary classes against that proletarian uprising, while these revolutionary classes, these counter-revolutionary classes or political organizations were also greatly fragmented by their competing interests. And it is so that there is a long-term counter-revolutionary process set in after June 48, which works itself out ultimately in a manner in which the proletariat is defeated anyway. But then each of these various political forces of the counter-revolution cancel themselves out, out of which emerges the resolution that comes, is in the form of the counter-revolution. And then that is where the text ends, and at the end, those brilliant passages, 2 or 3 paragraphs, on the evolution of the state, of the modern state, from the period of the absolutist monarchy up to the 50s. That insight is itself gained through the analysis of what went on during 3 years. So there are theoretical formulations prior to this undertaking of writing this text, but also learning something from this process. You know, what Engels said in the 1895 about not having access to the real truth of the structure at the time. I would actually put it another way. There was not only Bonapartist counter-revolution. It was to create not only an imperial, he became the emperor. So restoration of the imperial institution, which half of France believed as the proper form of the state. But number of things, he created a situation in which colonial conquest, he sets up a bourgeois conditions for the French bourgeoisie to grow not only within the national space, but to move out into the colonies. Now, I read it completely, beyond this text, that Napoleon's great achievement was to take the French Revolution out into much of the rest of Europe and create the environment, as Marx puts it, creates the environment in which the French bourgeoisie could establish its own stability in its own state, its own system, and come to really dominate the French society. And as Marx puts it, once he had achieved this, he was set aside by the Vienna Congress and so on. Now, the nephew, also, for him, also the solution is in expansion. But for him, expansion is into the colonies. And the French colonial state actually arose out of that counter-revolution. Now, of course, Marx didn't know that at the moment when he's writing, but there are traces of this insight in that in that text. And that is how the peasantry actually gets incorporated in the imperial institution and into the bourgeois interest by expansion of the army, into which the Society of December 10, that is to say the proletariat, lumpen proletariat and much of the peasantry, then goes into the empire, into the colonies. And many of the problems of class conflict in France is resolved in favor of the bourgeoisie through those processes.
I think that's a very important point, and there are elements in the 18th Brumaire that draw a straight line to the writings and debates that take place in the Communist International. 60 years later. I mean, when Lenin is sitting and trying to understand the complexity of the political situation in the United Kingdom, he also sees how the class question in England is resolved on the backs of the Irish and so on. Very interesting way to read the 18th Brumaire, and I actually haven't read anybody read it in those terms. I think that's fascinating. You began, and we can begin to close out the conversation on this. You began by talking about Marx as the great stylist. This is, I think, alongside Capital. I mean, people say that Capital is difficult to read, and I'm often confounded by that judgment because I think it's really a brilliantly written text. And I think that I point out to people, go read the footnotes first. If you're intimidated, look at the chapter on the machine or on the chapter on the working day and just read the footnotes. You'll see how clever Marx is,
My own view is that the reputation of Capital as a very difficult text to read is based entirely on the opening chapter on commodity.
Yes, but even that, the fourth section of that, where the table is listed, so on.
If you know already, then it's so beautifully composed and so on. But when I used to teach the Capital, I used to start with chapter 4, and then work my way back to commodities. Because if you throw that chapter on commodities at somebody who knows nothing about Marxist political economy, even if that person has done an MA in bourgeois economics, new classical type, that person has no means of really coming to that.
Well, because that chapter is not about economics. That chapter is about logic, and logic is an alienating form of thought if you're not comfortable in it.
Absolutely, yes.
But, I think this is, along with Capital, I think, in my opinion, two of the most incredibly written texts. I mean, yes, I know that there are lots of quotable quotes pulled out from the front, and maybe they've attained the status of cliche and so on. But when you go back and read even the first chapter and you see those quotes now no longer abstracted out, on a card, and you see them in the full paragraph. They're so well constructed.
And Vijay, that problem is even greater about what he says about the state at the end. You abstract that. You just take it out as some, Marxist theological wisdom about the text, without the analysis in which it is grounded. This is a very great problem with Marx, that he's so good at condensation that you can just take that as if, the wisdom is contained here. No, that wisdom has been actually acquired through very hard work of analysis. And the fundamental lesson of Marx is that theory per se cannot be applied. You need a very different kind of dialectical operation in order to read the world theoretically.
And I think, in terms of style, there is a mischief when people go to this text and pull out things. I mean, the sack of potatoes comment, for example, he actually doesn't call the peasantry a sack of potatoes. He's trying to talk about the political level, and he's trying to talk about how peasantries are disaggregated, and that, instead of them being, let's say, mashed potatoes all unified in
Yeah.
one, they are a set of differential things in a, I mean, he's trying to make a
Really, look,
different point. Yeah, go
look,
ahead.
even as you get to that sentence, sack of potatoes, um, he has talked about the nature of the French peasantry in the middle of the 19th century, when they have all become owners of petty property, too small, and he describes it at great length. It talks about how they live. He calls them caves. Some have one window, some have two windows, etc. He talks about isolation of all of them from each other. He talks about the fact that those things are so small that they can only employ family labor. You can't even employ hired labor. You can make no investment. This is a sentence about the French peasantry in 1850, 1849, 1850. It's not about peasantry as a whole, transhistorically. That is what the problem is. That it's a very vivid metaphorical statement. It's a metaphor. It's a very vivid metaphor. But it arises out of some, 7, 8 pages of describing the peculiarity of the situation of this peasantry, not about peasantry in general. And that is what happens when you pick out a sentence from here, and talk and give it the status of theological truth. You turn Marxism into some kind of theology.
And it's not, because this is a person building a theory of society, trying to change things. He's not attempting to be a prophet. His words should not be interpreted in that way. I think this is a brilliant text, and I hope this conversation will draw people back to struggle with it, read it, enjoy it. It's a highly enjoyable read. Um, this has been a great conversation. I know we're going to come back together next month. Next month will be toward the end of the 72 days of the Paris Commune, which opened on the 18th of March 1871, lasted 72 days, ended in late May. In late May, we'll be celebrating the 150th anniversary of that commune's defeat. The reason we are also going to celebrate the end of the commune period is because we take our lesson from Lenin, who said that, look, a defeat of the working class is not a defeat. It's educational, it's pedagogic, it's a school. You learn to win the next time. And that was the attitude with which Lenin interpreted the Paris Commune in State and Revolution. But we'll be meeting to talk about Marx's great text, The Civil War in France, delivered 2 days after the Commune was crushed, as an address to the International Working Men's Association. So we'll be back in a month. Thanks a lot, Aijaz. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll see. I'll see you next month.
Yes, exactly.
And we'll talk about it.